Hello everybody, Graham Herbst from the Nebraska Forest Service here. Standing in front of a pretty decent sized ginkgo tree, just kind of coming into its well-established period where it's starting to take off. But it has had some deer rub in the past. Homeowners tried some bars of soap and whatnot and hasn't had a whole lot of injury since, but the tree's definitely coming back into a vigorous growth rate. So we have to kind of try to retrain a central leader out of this tree to get a solid structure for it and more of a typical shape that you get. But we got a whole lot of competing leaders going on here, and so we're going to try to take a long-term approach to slowly training a better form out of this tree with some permanent scaffold branches. In the interest of that 1/3 cut rule, we don't really want to take off more than about 30% of most species in a given season. So this first go around is going to be just maybe 2 cuts, I'm guessing. We'll see how it goes. There are other ways that the number 3 comes into play with pruning. With a 3-cut pruning method, what we're doing is trying to minimize damage to the trunk that we're not trying to do and keep the damage on the branch where we're cutting it off. So what I have here is, this would be where I'd start my final cut just for demonstrative purposes. But the first cut is going to be right here in the saw, and it's an undercut just part of the way through the branch. That way, as I come up above it and start to take off the majority of the weight of the branch, if it begins to tear, then this cut here will intercept that tear before it gets all the way to the trunk and causes damage to a part of the tree that we're really trying to keep for the long run. And then finally we would take our 3rd cut and just clean up that stub that we're going to leave behind. So we'll see how this goes. In this case we had a pretty clean break, but if that branch started to go and it started to tear, then as I mentioned before, we would get that taken care of here before it would got into the rest of the stem. This is a nice little pruning saw. It's really a narrow blade, which can be less durable from a production standpoint, but it is nice for getting into tight branch angles when you're doing this sort of pruning. I almost forgot about that final cut. Here we have our final attempt at taking this branch off. You'll see that we have left some of this branch collar in place. Where the branch collar forms, that's a thickened area at the base of the branch that's usually pretty visible, not always. But you have an interlocking of trunk and branch wood that creates that thickness. And so by cutting into that collar, we're actually cutting into the wood of the trunk. So we do our best to minimize that and leave the branch collar in place when we take the branch off. Allow that tree to compartmentalize and seal off that wound as best as possible. So as you can see with this one branch out, we've already got maybe 15-20% of the canopy that we've taken out with that single cut. One thing that we want to be aware of, especially with thin bark species like maple, is if you have to do a lot of this stuff too aggressively, then you can allow a lot of sunlight that was originally shading the trunk to cause damage in the winter time, especially. We call it frost crack. And so, you always want to be aware that that might be a possibility if you're exposing a portion of stem or branch that was originally heavily shaded to a whole lot of sun. All of a sudden, that may happen. So I think we're going to go ahead and take 1 or 2 more of these lower limbs that would eventually come off, with the idea being that they've already gotten to a size where we don't want to let them get too much bigger before we cut them off. And then in coming growing seasons, we'll definitely address the crowding a little bit. Gives these branches the room and the spacing that they need to achieve the size that we're looking for, and again, try to suppress some of these other codominant leaders that are in there. Okay, so as you can see, I got a little bit more aggressive than I intended. We're probably more in the 35 to 40% range in terms of the amount of leaf surface area that I've taken out of the tree. What I found was, once I took some of these lower branches off and got them out of the way and could see inside better, there were some branches that were just getting too big for their britches and needed to come off, so I didn't have to make an even bigger cut the following year or 2. So keeping my collars intact as much as possible. Again, with these with the crowding, that narrow pruning saw blade is handy to minimize the damage to adjacent branches that you're not trying to cut off. But again, I just didn't want to leave a branch like this in another season or two to get to this size or so before I cut it off. So wanted to get in there and get that taken care of for the long term. So now we've really opened the canopy up a bit. We don't want to get any more aggressive than that, certainly. And now we can focus more on just trying to get a central leader trained back into the tree. Still some crowding, still some minor pruning cuts here and there, but that's my recommendation on this ginkgo. So we'll follow up on it in the coming seasons. So here are my 5 pruning cuts off this ginkgo. That is about, in my estimation, about 30 to 35% of the canopy. So looking up along the stem, you can see, you know, there's at least 2 to 3 times as many of those same size branches in there. Gives you a general idea of your pruning dose for the tree. So there we are. If you're doing pruning jobs and you don't end up with a lot of these little stubs to pick up with your undercut, your first cut, your undercut, and then your final cut on them, you may be taking unnecessary risks with the tearing on the trunk. So be careful. Thanks, guys.